Sarah's story. Sarah stood alone on the deserted train platform, her heart racing as she looked out into the inky darkness. It was late at night, and she was on her way back home from a party. The only sound she could hear was the steady rhythm of her own breathing, punctuated by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. As she waited for the train to arrive, Sarah's mind began to wander. She thought about the party she had just left and the friends she had said goodbye to. She thought about how much fun she had had and how much she was looking forward to getting home and crawling into bed. But then something caught her eye. At the end of the platform, Sarah saw a figure moving in the shadows. It was hard to make out who or what it was. But Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She thought she was alone, but now she wasn't so sure. The figure stepped closer and Sarah could see that it was a man. He was tall and thin, with a long dark coat that billowed around him in the wind. His face was hidden in the shadows, but Sarah could feel his gaze fixed upon her. Sarah tried to ignore the man and focus on the train, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She could feel his presence looming over her. Suddenly, the man began to move forward her, his footsteps echoing on the concrete platform. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, and she felt her palms clammy with sweat. She took a step back, her eyes never leaving the man's shadowy figure. But then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the man stopped in his tracks. Sarah held her breath, unsure of what was going to happen next, but the man simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness as if he had never been there at all. Sarah let out a sign of relief, but the fear remained. She knew that something wasn't right and that the man's presence on the platform was just the beginning. And as she waited for the train, she couldn't help but wonder what other horrors lay ahead. The train arrived with the screech of brakes. Her heart still racing from the encounter on the platform. She found a seat and tried to relax, but the memories of the man's ominous presence lingered in her mind. As the train rattled on, Sarah looked out the window at the passing scenery, but something caught her eye, something that made her blood run cold. Through the darkness, she saw the same figure from the platform standing on the tracks, watching the train as it passed by. His face was still hidden in the shadows, but Sarah knew that it was the same man. She tried to ignore him, tried to tell herself that it was just a coincidence, but then the train came to a stop and the lights flickered out. Sarah was plunged into darkness, and the man's presence was suddenly all around her. She could feel him getting closer, his breath hot on her neck. She tried to scream, tried to call for help, but no sound escaped her lips. She was trapped, alone, and terrified. And then, just as suddenly as the darkness had descended, the lights came back on. Sarah looked around, her heart pounding, but there was no sign of the man. She breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that she had imagined the whole thing, but as she got off the train and stepped onto the platform, she realized that she was not alone. The man from the platform was there, waiting for her. His face was still shrouded in darkness, but Sarah could feel his gaze fixed upon her once again. She tried to run, tried to escape, but it was no use. The man was too fast, too determined. He grabbed her by the arm and dragged her into the darkness, his grip like iron. Sarah screamed for help, but no one was around to hear her. She knew that it was the end, and she was going to die. And then, everything went black. Sarah felt a sharp pain in her head and then nothing. She had been knocked unconscious. When she came to, she was in a dark room, tied up and alone. She could feel the panic rising in her chest, and she realized that she was trapped, that there was no escape. The man from the platform had taken her, and now she was at his mercy. She didn't know what he wanted from her, but she knew that it couldn't be anything good. The darkness closed in around her, and Sarah felt herself slipping into unconsciousness again. She knew that she was in grave danger, and that the man from the platform was not done with her yet. 4 months later, the police arrived at the crime scene. They found Sarah dead. The pool. The sun had set, and the pool was illuminated by the soft glow of underwater lights. James decided to take a dip in the pool to cool off after a long day at work. He swam a few laps. As he floated on his back, James heard a strange noise coming from the water. He thought it might be a filter malfunction, but then he heard it again, closer this time. He turned to look, but there was nothing there. The water was still, and there was no sign of anything out of the ordinary. As he continued to swim, James felt a chill run down his spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He tried to ignore it, to tell himself that it was just an imagination. But then he saw something move in the water. It was too fast to be a fish, too large to be a bug. James panicked and tried to swim to the edge of the pool, but then he felt something grab his leg. He turned to see the creature, something he had never seen before, chasing him through the water. It was like a cross between a squid and an octopus, with reddened tentacles and gleaming black eyes. James tried to kick it off, but the creature's grip was too strong. He felt himself being pulled under the water, his lungs burning for air. As the creature dragged him deeper, James felt a cold, slimy tentacle wrap around his neck. He gasped for air, but the water rushed in, filling his lungs. He was drowning, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The creature had him in his grasp, and it wasn't going to let go. James thrashed and kicked as he struggled to break free from the creature's grip. His lungs burned as he fought for air, but the creature seemed to be sucking it away from him. Just when he thought he couldn't hold on any longer, the creature suddenly released him. James frantically swam to the surface, gasping for air and coughing up water. As he looked around, he saw the creature was nowhere to be found. But James knew that he was still out there, lurking in the water, waiting for its next victim. He quickly swam to the edge of the pool and hoisted himself out of the water, his heart pounding in his chest. He stumbled to his feet, shaking and disorientated. Suddenly, James heard a faint whisper, as if someone was speaking right in his ear. He turned around, but there was no one there. He heard it again, louder this time. It sounded like a voice, but not quite human. James felt a chill run down his spine, and he realized that it was coming from the pool. Slowly, he crept back towards the water's edge, his heart pounding in his chest. As he peered into the depth, he saw movement in the shadows. The creature was back, and this time it was bigger, darker, and more menacing than before. It had brought his friends with it, and they were circling him like vultures. James tried to run, but his legs were like lead. The creatures were closing in, and he knew that he was trapped. Suddenly the water erupted in a burst of black tentacles, engulfing him completely. James screamed, and he felt a slimy appendage wrapped around him, pulling him down into the darkness. The store. As Emma pushed the cart down the grocery store aisle, She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. She turned around, but there was no one there. She continued down the aisle, grabbing items off the shelves. But when she heard a strange noise behind her, it sounded like someone whispering her name, Emma. But the aisle was empty. She started to feel uneasy, like she was being followed. She picked up her pace, trying to get out of the store as quickly as possible. As she rounded the corner, Emma came face to face with a figure in a black hooded cloak. The figure was hunched, and it seemed to be shuffling towards her. But there was no face under the hood. Emma tried to back away, but the figure moved closer and closer. Suddenly the figure lunged at her, its arms outstretched, like it was going to grab her. Emma screamed and ran down the aisle, knocking over displays in her frantic escape. As she rounded another corner, Emma ran straight into a solid wall of flesh. She looked up to see a large, terrifying figure blocking her way. The figure had dark eyes and was wearing a blood-stained apron. Sarah could see chunks of meat hanging from hooks behind him. And she realized that she had stumbled into the store's meat locker. The figure reached out to grab her. She tried to push past him, but he was too strong. He picked her up effortlessly and carried her deeper into the freezer. Emma shivered in the cold, her breath coming out in the frosty cloud as she looked around the meat locker. She was surrounded by rows of hanging meat, and the air was thick with the stench of rotting flesh. She tried to struggle free from the figure's grip, but he was too strong. He carried her over the hook and began to tie her up, his eyes gleaming and sickening hunger. As he started to sharpen a large knife, Emma knew that she was in grave danger. She thrashed and screamed, but her captor didn't seem to notice. Just as the figure raised the knife to strike, a loud banging sound echoed through the freezer. The figure paused, looking around nervously. Suddenly the door burst open and a group of police officers rushed in, guns drawn. The figure dropped the knife and raised his hands in surrender. He saw that the figure was not a monster at all, but a deranged meat cutter who had gone on a peeling spree in the store. Relieved to be rescued, she knew that she would never forget the terror of being trapped in the meat locker. She couldn't shake the feeling that something else was still out there, waiting to haunt her once again. As she walked out of the store, a shadowy figure lurking in the distance. It was the same figure that she had seen in the aisle, the one that had chased her through the store. Paralyzed with fear, she couldn't believe that the figure was still there, still watching her. The figure started to move towards her, its hooded cloak billowing in the wind. Emma turned and ran, her heart pounding in her chest. As she looked back, she saw that the figure was still following her, its movements slow and deliberate. He knew that she couldn't outrun it forever. Just as she was about to be caught, it had all been a nightmare, but it had felt so real. As she lay there, trying to calm her racing heart, Emma couldn't help but wonder if the nightmare was a warning of something to come, something lurking in the shadows, waiting to haunt her once again.